Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I should have turned back. I knew better, but something about the old man's story had piqued my curiosity, and curiosity is a dangerous thing in these woods. It started at the ranger station. I was on a solo camping trip, looking for some peace and quiet, a break from the day-to-day grind. I stopped by to pick up a map and sign the trail log, just in case. The ranger behind the desk was an older man, grizzled and weathered like the trees themselves. He squinted at me as if sizing me up, and then asked if I'd ever heard of the Lost Trail. "Sure, I've heard of it," I replied, shrugging. "Just an old ghost story, right?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Not just a ghost story. People disappear out there for real. The forest has places that aren't meant for folks like us, and the Lost Trail, it leads straight to them." He didn't need to tell me twice. I'd read about the disappearances. It was always the same. Hikers and campers who took an unmarked path and were never seen again. But I figured if I stayed on the main trail, I'd be fine. Besides, ghost stories were just that, stories. I set out that afternoon, following the marked trail deep into the forest. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in soft golden rays. It was perfect. Hours passed, and I hadn't seen a soul. I was completely alone, surrounded by the quiet whisper of the trees. Eventually, I stopped to rest. I was sitting on a fallen log, enjoying a snack, when I noticed something odd. There, just off the trail, hidden behind a thick curtain of brush, was a path I hadn't seen before. It looked old, overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years. The ground was littered with strange symbols, carved into stones and trees, almost like they were marking the way. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the old man's story that tugged at me, or maybe it was just that damn curiosity. I stepped off the main trail, pushing my way through the underbrush, and set off down the hidden path. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew thick, heavy, and I noticed a faint smell like rotting wood and damp earth. I can't say how long I walked. Time felt strange out there, stretching and bending like the trees that seemed to grow denser around me. And then I saw it, an old wooden sign, half buried in the ground. The words "Lost Trail" barely visible beneath layers of moss. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard something, a faint whisper just behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Only trees, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. I kept walking, hoping I'd find some sign of where I was, but the path only grew narrower, the trees closing in until they were almost suffocating. I should have turned back, but I felt compelled to press on, like something was guiding me forward. And then I saw it, an old cabin hidden between the trees. It was decayed, falling apart, yet somehow still standing. I hesitated, but that damn curiosity got the best of me again, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the walls were covered in symbols, just like the ones I'd seen on the trail. There were shelves lined with jars, filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. Bones, teeth, things that looked like pieces of fur and hair. It was a shrine to something dark, something I didn't want to understand. Then I heard it again, a whisper louder this time, almost like a voice. I spun around and saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and a face that was all wrong, features too stretched, eyes too deep. It smiled, and in that moment I knew I was trapped. It stepped into the cabin, moving with an unnatural grace, its eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I backed away, my heart pounding. but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, and I felt the temperature drop, the cold seeping into my bones. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, but it didn't answer. It only smiled wider, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. I could feel my body freezing up, my mind going numb, and that's when I realized the old man was right. The lost trail wasn't just a path. It was a trap, a lure for the curious and the foolish, and I'd walked right into it. I don't know how I managed to move, but I turned and bolted out of the cabin, tearing through the underbrush, not caring about the branches that scraped my face and arms. I just ran, desperate to escape, to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The forest seemed to shift around me, trees and shadows blending together until I couldn't tell where I was going. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, like they were pulling me back, dragging me into the darkness. At some point I must have tripped, because the next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, staring up at the sky. The first light of dawn was breaking through the trees, and I could hear the sounds of the forest again. The birds, the wind, everything back to normal. But when I looked around, I realized I was right back where I started, at the edge of the trail, as if I'd never left. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sign of the cabin, no sign of the lost trail. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole, taking its secrets with it. I made my way back to the ranger station, half expecting to see the old man there, but he was gone. Another ranger, a young guy, was sitting behind the desk. I asked him about the lost trail, about the old man, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. "There hasn't been anyone else working here for years," he said, shrugging. "And there's no trail by that name. Must have just been a bad dream. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The forest is more than just trees and animals. There are things out there, hidden paths and secrets that were never meant to be found. And sometimes curiosity is enough to draw you in, to lead you somewhere you can't escape." As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees watching me. But there was nothing there, only shadows, stretching long and deep, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in. And I know someday someone will. I should have listened to my gut. The second we parked the car at the trailhead, something felt wrong, but it was late, and the rest of the group, Mia, Sam, and Jason, were all buzzing with excitement for the trip. We'd been planning this weekend for months, a 2-night camping trip deep in the untouched woods of Blackwater Forest. No cell service, no people, just pure isolation. Perfect, right? We should have turned back. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The air was cool, but something about it felt thick, almost like it was suffocating, hanging around us like the woods themselves were waiting for something. The first night was calm, for the most part. We laughed around the campfire, told ghost stories, the usual. But when the fire started dying down, the woods around us grew unnervingly silent. Not just the normal quiet of a remote forest, but a complete and unnatural stillness. No insects buzzing, no leaves rustling. Just nothing. "I don't like this," Mia had whispered, staring into the trees. "It's too quiet." Jason, always the skeptic, chuckled and tossed another log onto the fire. "Come on, it's just nature. No wolves or bears out here. Relax." But I couldn't shake it. My senses were on edge, like every part of me was tuned in to something that wasn't there, or at least something I couldn't see. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know what stirred me, maybe a noise, maybe the cold. But when I opened my eyes, I felt that thick, oppressive feeling again. My tent was zipped shut, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the nylon wall, watching. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. It wasn't an animal, at least not any I recognized. The steps were too measured, too heavy. I held my breath, every instinct in me screaming to stay silent. The sound circled the tent, moving closer, and then stopped right outside. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, but eventually the footsteps retreated, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I told the others about the footsteps. Sam, always the logical one, tried to explain it away as an animal. Maybe it was a deer or a boar, he said, shrugging. But Mia's eyes met mine, and I could tell she didn't buy it. She had heard it too. We both had. That day we hiked deeper into the woods, following an old trail that barely seemed to exist anymore. It felt like we were walking into another world, the trees growing denser, the light filtering through the canopy in thin, sickly beams. As we walked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees, not carvings or scratches, but symbols. Odd, jagged shapes that made my skin crawl just looking at them. When I pointed them out to the others, Sam shrugged again, dismissing it as old Native American stuff. But I knew better. These weren't relics of the past. They were recent, fresh. By the time we reached a clearing, the sun was starting to dip again, and the air felt even heavier than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just watched, followed. I kept glancing back, expecting to see something between the trees. A shadow, a figure. But there was nothing, only that suffocating stillness. We set up camp in the clearing, and that's when things really started to go wrong. It was Mia who saw it first. She had wandered off to collect firewood and came running back, pale and breathless. "There's something in the woods," she gasped, pointing frantically behind her. It looked like a person, but it wasn't." "What do you mean, wasn't?" Jason asked, laughing nervously. "You probably just saw a deer or something." Mia shook her head violently. No, it stood up. It was on all fours, but it stood up like a man. But its legs, they were all wrong. Backward like—" She stopped, shuddering, unable to finish. We laughed it off at first, thinking she was spooked, but as night fell, the mood shifted. The quiet returned, deeper this time, more oppressive. We all felt it. And then the noises started. At first it was a distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like the night before. But this time, they weren't circling the tents. They were coming toward us, and we huddled around the fire, our flashlights scanning the tree line. And then we saw it. A figure, just barely visible between the trees, crouched low to the ground. It moved with an unnatural grace, too fast, too fluid. And then, just as Mia had said, it stood up. Its legs bent wrong, like a human body forced into an animal's form. The head was elongated like a snout, but the eyes, God, the eyes, they were human, too human. Sam swore under his breath, stumbling backward. "What the hell is that?" We backed away slowly, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Then, without warning, it dropped back onto all fours and slunk into the shadows, vanishing into the forest. We didn't sleep that night. No one spoke. We just sat there waiting, listening to the sounds of the forest that never came. By morning, we were ready to leave, but as we packed up camp, we noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around our camp, in the dirt, were footprints. Huge, clawed prints, far too large to belong to any animal. They were everywhere, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. The hike back was hell. Every step felt like we were being watched, like that thing was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mia kept muttering under her breath, eyes darting around like she was trying to see it before it saw her. We reached the car just before dusk, but as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the edge of the parking lot just beyond the trees was the figure again. It stood there watching us, motionless. Then slowly it raised a hand, no, not a hand, but a twisted claw, and pointed directly at me. We sped out of there as fast as we could, but even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can still feel it watching. I see it sometimes in the corners of my vision, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, because it knows where I am. I never thought I'd end up telling this story to anyone, much less strangers on the internet. But hell, maybe it'll help me sleep at night if I can finally get it out. Or maybe it'll just remind me how real everything was. Either way, I'm tired of keeping this to myself. So here it is. I used to be a park ranger, the kind of guy you'd see strolling through state parks with a smile on my face, happy to answer questions about hiking trails and safe camping practices. I loved my job. It was everything I'd wanted since I was a kid. I grew up in the woods, so it always felt like home to me, a place where I could be free, peaceful, safe. That all changed last fall. I was stationed at the Black Hollow State Park, a huge stretch of wilderness, deep forests, and isolated lakes that didn't see much foot traffic outside of hunting season. On one particular night, I was tasked with patrolling the northern edge of the park. A lone camping permit had come through earlier in the week, and it was my job to check in on campers, make sure no one was getting into trouble. The weather was unseasonably cold that night, a biting chill that cut straight through my ranger uniform, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I took my ATV out along the dirt paths, winding between pines and oaks, their limbs stretching like skeletal fingers overhead. The moon was full but shrouded in mist, casting pale light through a haze of fog. It felt like the world was holding its breath, silent, waiting for something. I should have taken it as a sign. After about an hour of driving, I found the campsite, a lone tent pitched next to a dying fire, with an old pickup truck parked nearby, a perfect spot for some peace and quiet, away from everything. I turned off my engine and the sound echoed through the emptiness before falling into dead silence. I called out, a quick "Park Ranger, just checking in," and waited for a response. Nothing. I got off the ATV, shining my flashlight around the site. The tent flaps were open, and when I peeked inside, it was empty. But their gear was still there, sleeping bags, cooler, a couple of books. It looked like whoever was camping just wandered off. Maybe they went for a walk, I thought, but in this cold, in the dark, it didn't add up. I decided to do a quick search around the site, shining my flashlight into the trees. The forest loomed like a wall around the clearing, thick and oppressive. Every now and then, my light would catch something in the darkness, a squirrel skittering away, the glint of a spider's eyes, but no sign of the camper. That's when I heard it. A low guttural growl, deep and long, like it came from something massive. It rumbled through the air and into my chest, making my whole body tense up. My hand instinctively went to my hip, where my sidearm was holstered. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, a big one maybe, but I'd been around bears before. This wasn't that. It was wrong. I spun around, aiming my flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. 2 eyes. Yellow, glowing in the dark, just beyond the tree line. They were set too high for any normal animal, staring down at me from at least 7, maybe 8 feet up. And the thing didn't blink. It just watched me. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked, echoing back to me in the eerie silence. The eyes narrowed and I heard something like a soft laugh, a horrible wet rasp, almost human but not quite. I felt a creeping fear crawl up my spine, and I swear, it felt like the trees themselves were closing in around me. Then the eyes moved. Quick, too quick. 1 second they were staring right at me, and then they darted to the right, disappearing behind the trees. I fumbled with my flashlight, trying to track the movement, but it was gone. That's when the screams started, blood-curdling, agonized screams that seemed to come from every direction at once, bouncing through the forest like a sickening echo. I ran to my ATV, fumbling with the keys as the screams grew louder, closer. They didn't sound human. They were too high-pitched, like the wail of a rabbit mixed with a woman's cry. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the engine to start. The second the engine roared to life, the screaming stopped. Dead silence again, like someone had flipped a switch. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, that gut-wrenching sensation of being watched. And then I saw it. In my side mirror, just behind me in the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs too long, its body thin and hunched, like it was made of sticks bound together. It looked like a person, but all wrong, and those eyes, those yellow eyes locked onto me, glowing with an otherworldly light. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. I hit the gas and tore out of there, the ATV skidding and bouncing over roots and rocks as I sped back down the trail. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept going, the engine screaming in the night, the wind biting at my face. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, breathless and covered in a cold sweat. When I tried to explain what I saw, my supervisor just gave me a look, one of those "you're tired and seeing things" looks, and told me to take the rest of the night off. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I sat in the corner of my cabin, lights on, shotgun in my lap, staring out the window. But nothing came. The next day I went back to the campsite with a few other rangers. The tent was still there, undisturbed, the fire pit cold. But there were no signs of the camper. And here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. We found tracks, but not human tracks. Deep prints in the mud like clawed hands, each finger long and tapered, with strange marks crisscrossing like scales or fur. They led away from the tent, vanishing into the forest like the creature had taken flight. The camper was never found. No body, no gear, just gone. I quit a week later. Couldn't shake that feeling of those yellow eyes on me burning into my soul. I moved to the city, as far from the woods as I could get, but at night sometimes. I hear that laughter, that wet, rasping sound, and I see those eyes. I've told myself it was all just my imagination, a trick of the fog, or the cold, or maybe just a bear. But deep down I know the truth. Somewhere out there in the black hollow something is watching, waiting. And if you're ever out there, pray it never finds you. I had always thought of camping as a retreat, a way to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. I wasn't prepared for the darkness that lurked just beyond the tree line, nor the horrors that awaited me in the depths of the Blackthorn woods. It was late September when I decided to take a solo trip into the woods. I had heard rumors about the place, stories of strange occurrences and people going missing. But those were just stories, right? I dismissed them as mere embellishments, typical campfire tales. After all, I was an experienced hiker and camper, or so I thought. I arrived at the campsite just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birds. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that loomed like sentinels. As I built my fire and prepared dinner, I felt a sense of tranquility wash over me. But as night fell, an unsettling silence enveloped the woods, as if the forest had drawn a breath and held it. The first night was peaceful enough. I roasted marshmallows, listened to the crackling of the fire, and marveled at the stars piercing through the inky sky. But then, around midnight, I heard it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the very depths of the woods. It sent chills down my spine. Wolves, I thought. Maybe a coyote. I reminded myself that I was in their territory. But the howl came again, this time closer, almost human in its desperation. It echoed through the trees, twisting and rising into a scream that made my blood run cold. I turned off my lantern, plunging myself into darkness, and strained my ears trying to discern the source. Just then my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into utter blackness. Panic bubbled up inside me as I fumbled for my backup flashlight. The howling continued, growing more frantic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Finally, I managed to get the flashlight working again and shone it into the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure stood just at the edge of the tree line, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, and its silhouette seemed to twist unnaturally. I could barely make out its features. Its eyes were glowing, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like two fiery coals. The figure stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of its face, a grotesque mask of shadows and bone, with a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing teeth like jagged knives. I stumbled back, heart racing, the beam of light shaking as I pointed it at the creature. It let out a sound, a combination of a growl and a wheeze, like it was struggling to breathe. I felt the weight of dread press down on me, urging me to flee, but I was frozen in place, caught in its gaze. With a sudden movement, it lunged forward, and that snapped me out of my trance. I grabbed my gear and took off, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where I was going. The howls echoed behind me, more frantic now, a cacophony of voices merging into a single chilling sound. I ran until I couldn't breathe, pushing my body through the thick branches and foliage, desperate to escape. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I was certain it was right behind me, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing but the dense shadows of the forest. Finally, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and broken. I hesitated, but I could hear the creature's howls closing in, and instinct took over. I flung open the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it tight. Inside, the cabin was empty and decaying, with dust-covered furniture and a musty smell that filled the air. I crept through the rooms, heart pounding, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The howling outside became frantic, slamming against the cabin like a physical force, rattling the walls. Just then, I noticed something on the wall, newspaper clippings, faded and yellowed with age. I stepped closer, squinting to read the headlines. Local man disappears near Blackthorn Woods. Unexplained howls haunt campers. Mysterious figure seen in woods. A chill raced down my spine. These weren't just old stories, they were warnings. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that the creature outside had claimed its victims, and I was now part of its twisted narrative. I backed away from the wall, heart racing, and turned just as the door rattled violently. Something was trying to get in. I grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the floor and prepared to defend myself. The howling reached a deafening pitch, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. A silence fell over the woods, thick and oppressive. I waited, breathless, every muscle tensed. I peered out the broken window, trying to catch a glimpse of the creature. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, and for a brief moment I saw it standing at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing brighter than before. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't know how long I stood there staring back at that thing. The air felt charged with tension, a standoff between predator and prey. And then, without warning, it turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like hours, but the silence remained. Finally, I gathered the courage to leave the cabin. I had to get out of those woods. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. It was gone, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. I stumbled back to my campsite, adrenaline coursing through me. The tent was still standing, untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I hastily packed my things, keeping my eyes on the dark trees around me, ready for anything. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I kept hearing whispers in the wind, calling my name, taunting me. I wanted to scream, to run faster, but I knew that the woods were not done with me yet. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze lingering on my back, a constant reminder of the terror I had just faced. When I finally reached my truck, I flung my gear in and sped off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, heart racing and hands shaking. The woods faded behind me, but the whispers didn't stop. I never returned to Blackthorn Woods, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that haunting howl echoing in my mind. I can still feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for the day when I might step back into its territory. and I wonder, what would it take for it to finally claim me? The air in the woods felt heavy, almost thick, as I followed the narrow path deeper into the forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip. Just me, some quiet time, and nature. No distractions, no work, no stress. That's what I needed. It had been months since I'd taken a break, and this patch of wilderness, far from the busy roads and buzzing phones, seemed perfect. The trees were dense, their branches overhead knitting together to block out most of the daylight. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, the forest had a twilight feel, a dimness that set my nerves on edge, though I couldn't explain why. I told myself it was just the solitude, the unfamiliar sounds of nature making my imagination run wild. But something about the way the light didn't reach the forest floor, how the shadows seemed to shift and stretch, kept me glancing over my shoulder. I reached my chosen campsite, a small clearing nestled between towering pines, their bark mottled with lichen. It was eerily quiet. No wind rustling the leaves, no birds calling to each other, not even the distant hum of insects. Just silence. It felt wrong, but I brushed it off. I was just jumpy. After setting up my tent and getting a small fire going, I sat back, trying to enjoy the peace. But that feeling lingered. You know that sensation? When you're being watched. My skin prickled. I scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, hidden in the shadows. Nothing. I shook my head. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, poking at the fire to keep my hands busy. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck refused to settle. The first sign that something was off came when the sun dipped below the horizon. It was fast, too fast. One moment, the sky was a dull gray, and the next, it was as if someone had switched off the lights. Darkness pressed in around me, thicker than it should have been. My fire, small and crackling, seemed like the only point of warmth in an endless void. And then the noises started. At first they were distant, low, guttural sounds, almost like animals, but not quite. They came from deep within the forest, far beyond the reach of my firelight. I tried to tell myself it was just wildlife, but each sound was wrong, somehow distorted, like it was trying to imitate something it didn't quite understand. A snapping twig, a rustle of leaves. Something was moving out there, just beyond where I could see. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating only thick trunks and tangled undergrowth. But the noises stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sounds. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Minutes passed. My breath sounded too loud in the quiet. Maybe it was just some animal, curious about the fire. Or maybe it was nothing at all. And then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the light's reach, partially obscured by the trees. "Hey," I called out, more to reassure myself than anything. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I pointed the flashlight toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. But as soon as the beam touched where it had been, nothing. No one was there. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. I stood frozen, staring at the spot for what felt like an eternity. The fire crackled behind me, but the rest of the world was unnaturally still. Then came the smell. It hit me like a wave, sickly sweet, like rot mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned. It was so strong that I could taste it in the back of my throat. I stumbled back toward the fire, desperate for the warmth and light. My eyes darted to the trees, scanning for movement, but I saw nothing. Yet, the smell grew stronger. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear now. I grabbed the hatchet from my gear and held it tight, my knuckles white. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave, to get out of these woods. But leaving meant heading into that blackness, into whatever was out there watching me. Another snap echoed from the forest, closer this time. I swung the flashlight toward the sound and saw something, not a person, not an animal. It was hunched, its body twisted and wrong, with long, thin limbs that didn't seem to belong to it. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes were glowing. I blinked, convinced I was imagining it. But it moved. Fast. Too fast. The thing darted between the trees, a blur of sickly flesh, before disappearing into the dark. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my pack, my heart racing. My mind scrambled for explanations, but none of them made sense. What the hell had I just seen? My legs felt weak, like they might give out, but I forced myself to stay on my feet. Suddenly there was a sound, a voice, low and garbled, coming from deep in the woods. "Help me!" It was faint, almost like it had been carried on the wind. But it was unmistakable. And it wasn't far away. "Hello?" I called out, though my voice trembled. "Who's out there?" "Help. Me." The voice came again, closer now, clearer. But there was something wrong with it. Something deeply wrong. The tone was off, the cadence unnatural, as if whoever was speaking didn't fully understand how to use their voice. I shined the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the light only revealed more trees and darkness. The smell of rot grew stronger. And then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw it again, the figure. But this time it was standing upright, its limbs impossibly long, its head cocked to one side like a curious animal. It took a step closer, and in the flickering light of the fire I saw its face. No, not a face. It was wearing a face. My face. The skin was stretched across its skull like a mask, too tight, too perfect. Its mouth twitched, trying to form words. Help. Me. But the voice wasn't mine. It lunged. Everything went black. When I woke, the fire was out. The woods were silent. I was alone. And all I could smell was rot. I've always been drawn to the woods. The solitude, the towering trees, the moss-covered earth, they all held a strange, almost magnetic allure for me. So when I landed a job as a park ranger in one of the most remote stretches of forest in the state, I jumped at the chance. They warned me it wasn't for everyone. Strange things had happened in these woods, they said. People would hear things, see things that didn't make sense, but I shrugged it off. I've always liked the quiet, and I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. It was my third night on the job when I first heard the sounds. I was doing my rounds, weaving my way through the dense trees. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating glimpses of gnarled roots and skeletal branches. The forest felt different that night, thicker somehow, as if the darkness was pressing in, breathing with its own life. It was then I heard a distant, low howl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, a mournful wail that seemed to echo from every direction. I stopped, listening, straining to hear past the eerie silence that followed. My radio crackled, startling me. I thought it might be my supervisor checking in, but all I heard was static, punctuated by garbled, unintelligible words. I couldn't make them out, but I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something wasn't right. I decided to cut my patrol short and head back to the ranger station. On the way, I felt as though I was being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the hairs rising ever so slightly. But soon it grew stronger, impossible to ignore. I turned, swinging my flashlight around, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, just shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I picked up my pace, trying to ignore the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow my footsteps. The howl came again, closer this time, and then another sound, a guttural growl, low and menacing. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, straining to see. I knew the woods had wolves, but this was different. It sounded wrong, like a distorted imitation of an animal, something that wasn't meant to be there. I took a deep breath and continued on, forcing myself to keep moving. Just as the lights of the ranger station came into view, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A shadow, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. I whipped my flashlight toward it, but it was gone. I ran the rest of the way, slamming the door behind me, breathing heavily as I leaned against it. My heart thundered in my chest and my hands were shaking. The next day I chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by isolation and the eerie stories I'd heard from the locals. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that shadow, the strange noises and the oppressive feeling of being watched. I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal and set out for my patrol once more. But that night, things only got stranger. I had barely set foot into the woods when I saw the footprints. They were massive, larger than any animal that should be roaming these parts. They resembled a dog's tracks, but the shape was distorted, elongated, as if something had pressed its weight into the ground and twisted. The sight of them filled me with a creeping dread, but I pressed on, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. As I ventured deeper, the forest grew darker, the trees seeming to close in around me. The air was thick, heavy with a stench that I couldn't quite place, rotting meat mixed with something metallic. I covered my nose, pushing forward, my flashlight flickering as if it too was scared of the dark. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like something large moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. The trees loomed around me, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and crawl. I took a step back, trying to get my bearings, but the forest had changed. The path I had followed was gone, replaced by dense thickets and unfamiliar terrain. Panic started to set in as I realized I was lost. The sounds grew closer, more distinct, a snapping of twigs, a guttural breathing that sent chills down my spine. I turned, trying to find my way back, but every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to shift, their branches reaching out as if to grab me, to pull me deeper into the darkness. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall, towering over me, with elongated limbs and a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, reflecting back at me with a predatory gleam. It looked like a twisted, nightmarish version of a man, but there was something undeniably animalistic about it, as if it had been pieced together from parts that didn't quite fit. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature let out a low growl, its mouth opening to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes as I fled. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of its footsteps followed me, heavy and relentless, as if it was toying with me, letting me think I had a chance before it closed in. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into a clearing. The moon hung overhead, casting an eerie light on the scene before me. There, in the center of the clearing, was a circle of stones, each one covered in strange, indecipherable markings. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and in the center of the circle lay a pile of bones, arranged in some twisted ritual. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing. The creature was close now, its breath hot on the back of my neck. I spun around, bracing myself for the inevitable, but as I turned, I found myself staring at nothing. The creature was gone. The forest was silent once more, the only sound my ragged breathing. I stumbled back to the ranger station, shaken and disoriented. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. They found me the next morning, huddled in the corner of the station, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I don't work there anymore. I don't go near the woods. I can't. I know what I saw, even if no one else believes me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that howl, and I wonder if it's out there, waiting, watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. I should have known something was wrong the minute we arrived at Devil's Hollow, but I was tired of city life, and I'd read online that this isolated pocket of wilderness had some of the best hiking and camping trails in the state. So, when my buddy Mike suggested we go out for a long weekend, I didn't hesitate. The drive took longer than expected, the road twisting and narrowing until it was barely wide enough for our truck. The trees grew denser as we neared our destination, branches arching overhead to block out the sunlight, casting everything in an eerie green twilight. There were no other cars, no signs, not even a hint of other campers. We found an open clearing just as dusk was settling in, but it didn't feel right. The air was thick, heavy, almost stifling. A strange metallic odor hung around us, and I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. But Mike shrugged it off, joking that we'd found the perfect spot for a haunted camping trip. We set up camp and got a fire going, trying to push back the creeping darkness. As the night deepened, the woods around us grew unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no birds, no crickets. Just an oppressive silence that made me feel like we were the only two people left in the world. "Did you hear that?" Mike suddenly whispered, his eyes darting to the edge of the clearing. I strained to listen but heard nothing. "Probably just a deer," I said, hoping to reassure myself as much as him. But then a low growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't a sound I recognized, too deep for a coyote, too guttural for a bear. It was almost human. Mike and I exchanged uneasy glances, and I could see the tension in his jaw as he gripped his flashlight tighter. We tried to shake it off, talking about anything and everything to drown out the silence, but something felt wrong, like we were being watched. The fire cast long shadows around the clearing, and every now and then I thought I saw shapes moving just out of sight, slipping between the trees. And then, just past midnight, we saw him. A man emerged from the shadows, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat, his clothes tattered and smeared with mud. At first I thought he might be another camper, maybe lost, but as he moved closer, I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand, a long, rusted hunting knife. "You boys lost?" he rasped, his voice rough as gravel, his eyes glinting like shards of glass in the firelight. "We're fine," Mike replied, trying to sound confident. "Just camping for the weekend." The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not many people come out to Devil's Hollow anymore," he said. "Not since the disappearances." My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard about any disappearances, but there was something about the way he said it that made me want to pack up and leave that very second. The man took a step closer, and I could see something was off about him. His skin looked stretched, too tight, as if it didn't quite fit his bones. "You boys should leave," he whispered, the words barely more than a hiss. "They don't like strangers here." Without another word, he melted back into the darkness, leaving us alone with the fire crackling quietly between us. We sat there in stunned silence, unsure if we should laugh it off or take it as a serious warning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching us, lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. And then we heard it, a low echoing howl that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. It was followed by another and then another, until the woods were alive with the haunting chorus. They sounded almost like wolves, but distorted, broken, like something trying to mimic the sound of an animal and failing. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling as I stood up, grabbing my pack. But as I turned to leave, I saw them, figures moving through the trees, their eyes reflecting the firelight, glowing an unnatural shade of red. They were humanoid, but their limbs were too long, their bodies hunched and twisted. There was a stench of decay, of something old and rotting, and I realized with a sickening lurch that these things weren't human. Mike and I scrambled to extinguish the fire, throwing dirt over the embers as quickly as we could, but the creatures were getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath their feet, the wet rasp of their breathing as they closed in on us. We took off running, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise we made. The creatures pursued us, their guttural snarls echoing through the trees, their footsteps unnervingly fast. Every time I glanced back, I saw them, their twisted forms moving in ways that defied logic, closing the distance between us. We ran until we burst onto an old overgrown path, nearly colliding with another figure, a park ranger, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Relief flooded through me as I realized we'd found help. But when he turned to face us, my heart sank. His face was familiar, too familiar. It was the same man who had visited our campsite, though now he was clean, his uniform immaculate. His eyes, however, held that same unnerving glint. "You boys didn't listen," he said, shaking his head. "I told you they don't like strangers here." He raised his flashlight, illuminating the path ahead, and I saw them, the creatures, waiting in the shadows, their red eyes glowing, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. They were surrounding us, moving closer, closing off any chance of escape. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "I'm the caretaker of Devil's Hollow," he replied. "And you? You're just tonight's offering." The creatures surged forward, their hands reaching for us, cold and clammy, dragging us into the darkness. I fought, clawing at the ground, at anything I could grab hold of, but it was no use. Their grip was unbreakable, their strength inhuman. The last thing I remember was the ranger's face twisted into a mask of satisfaction as he watched us being pulled into the shadows, his eyes glowing red like the creatures surrounding us. I woke up alone, back in the truck, my head pounding. Mike was gone, his things nowhere to be found, and when I tried to start the engine, it was dead. There was no cell signal, no sign of the ranger, no trace of our campsite. I walked for hours before I finally found the main road, flagged down a car, and made it back to town. I told the police, but they just shook their heads. "No one goes to Devil's Hollow," they said. "It's been closed for years." I still dream about that night, about the creatures and their glowing eyes, about the ranger with his twisted smile. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear that low, guttural howl drifting through the air, calling me back to Devil's Hollow. I've been camping my whole life. Growing up, my dad would take me and my older brother, Jason, out into the wilderness every summer. I'd learned how to set up tents, start fires, and navigate the woods with just a compass and the stars. I thought I knew the woods, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that trip last October. It was just the three of us, Jason, me, and my best friend Dylan. We were heading to a place deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest trailhead. Jason had heard about this spot from some guy at a bar, some off-the-grid campsite tucked into a valley surrounded by towering pine trees. He swore it was the perfect place for stargazing, totally isolated. We hiked for hours that day, the trail disappearing until we were blazing our own path through the underbrush. By the time we found the spot, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was perfect, just like Jason said. A clearing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick, ancient pines. We set up camp quickly just before dusk. A cool breeze rustled through the treetops, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt like the woods were alive, breathing around us. We joked around the fire, passing a flask of whiskey, the flames dancing as we swapped old stories. The moon hung high and full above us, casting silver light through the branches. It should have been peaceful, but something was off. I noticed it first, the smell. It wasn't your usual forest scent of pine and earth. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as the night wore on. It smelled like something rotting, like an animal that had died and been left to decay in the woods. "Do you smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. Dylan nodded, glancing around. "Yeah, man. Maybe a deer died nearby or something." Jason shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The smell wasn't normal, and it seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest itself was steeped in decay. I told myself I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the chill crawling up my spine. As the fire died down and the night grew darker, the noises began. At first it was faint, just a whisper like the wind shifting through the trees. But then I realized it wasn't the wind. It was voices. Low, murmuring voices carried through the night. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, scanning the trees. Jason paused, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "The voices," I said, my heart pounding. "It sounds like whispering." Dylan leaned closer to the fire, his face lit up with unease. "It's just the wind, man. You're freaking yourself out." But I knew it wasn't the wind. The whispers were growing louder, more distinct, like they were circling us, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. Then, without warning, the forest went completely silent. No wind, no insects, no crackling of the fire. Just nothing. I turned to Jason, but before I could speak, we heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. Dylan stood up, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the hell is that?" Jason grabbed his own flashlight, sweeping it through the trees. "Probably an animal," he muttered, but even his voice wavered. We stood there, flashlights cutting through the darkness, hearts pounding in unison, waiting. Then we saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, standing just beyond the reach of our lights. It was watching us. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make out any details. It was too far to see clearly, but something about it was wrong. Its shape was distorted, like it didn't fit the space it occupied, as if the shadows clung to it unnaturally. "Who's there?" Jason called out, trying to sound confident. The figure didn't move. "Dude, let's just pack up and get out of here," Dylan whispered, his voice trembling. Jason shook his head, his jaw tight. "It's just someone messing with us." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew. No one else was supposed to be out here. No one else could be out here. This place was too remote. Suddenly the figure moved, but not toward us. It slipped back into the shadows, vanishing between the trees without a sound. And just like that, the forest came alive again. The wind picked up, the fire crackled, the distant sound of insects resumed. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. Jason didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the woods, his face pale. We sat in silence for a while, no one willing to admit how terrified we were. But after what felt like hours, we finally decided to call it a night. Jason insisted we stay, that it was nothing, just some hiker passing through. But I saw the way his hands shook as he zipped up his tent. I couldn't sleep. Every little sound jolted me awake, my mind replaying the image of that figure over and over again. I lay there, listening to the forest, the whispers creeping back into the edges of my consciousness. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. I shot up, heart racing. They were slow, shuffling, moving through the campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen, praying it was just Jason or Dylan going for a piss break. Then I heard the zipper of Jason's tent. "Jason," I whispered. No response. The footsteps continued, but they weren't moving away. They were circling the tents. Around and around. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent just a crack, peeking out. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I froze. Standing in the middle of the campsite, facing away from me, was Jason. "Jason," I whispered again, louder this time, but he didn't move. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight shaking in my hand. "Jason, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, unnaturally still, his back to me. As I approached him, my flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I heard it, a whisper, right by my ear. "Run!" I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. When I turned back to Jason, he was gone. Panic surged through me. I ran to Dylan's tent, shaking him awake. "Dylan, we need to go, now." We grabbed our gear, not even bothering to pack everything properly, and bolted. We ran through the woods, not stopping, not looking back. The entire time I could feel it. Something was following us. The whispers grew louder, circling us, closing in, When we finally reached the car, we drove like hell out of there, not saying a word. We never found Jason. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but he was gone. Just gone. No trace, no tracks, nothing. But here's the thing that still haunts me. A week after we returned, I got a text from Jason's number. Just one word. Run. I don't go camping anymore. I always thought camping alone would be peaceful. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature surrounding me, giving me a break from the chaos of the world. I'd done it plenty of times before, but this time was different. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a chance to clear my mind. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. I drove out early, the sun barely rising, eager to reach a spot deep in the wilderness that I'd discovered months ago. It was perfect. Far off the beaten trail, nestled beside a small stream, with thick trees creating a natural barrier around the clearing. No cell service, no people, just silence. The hike to the spot was longer than I remembered, the forest denser, more suffocating. But I didn't mind. I welcomed the isolation. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over everything. I quickly set up my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, something felt off. It wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly, like a pressure building in my chest. The forest around me seemed too quiet, like the usual night sounds. The chirping of insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush were muted. I could still hear the stream trickling nearby, but even that sounded distant, like it was further away than it should have been. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to being alone out here. I had a cup of coffee, stared at the fire, and tried to relax. But the feeling only got worse. There was something wrong with the air, like it was heavy, thick, making it hard to breathe. Then the noises started. At first it was a soft rustling, almost too quiet to notice. Just the wind, I thought, brushing through the trees. But the sound was steady, deliberate, and it seemed to circle my camp, staying just outside the reach of the firelight. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flickering flames. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a little stupid for speaking to the empty woods. But no one answered. The rustling stopped. I waited, listening, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. For a moment, everything was still again. I sat back down, poking at the fire, trying to shake the creeping unease. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, something curious but harmless. I didn't feel any better. A few hours passed and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The woods were pitch black now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I decided to call it a night and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. I didn't know why I felt the need to lock myself in, but something told me to. I lay there in the darkness, listening. That's when I heard it again. The rustling, louder this time, closer. It wasn't circling the camp anymore. It was right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat feeling like a hammer. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The rustling stopped directly beside me, and I could hear something breathing. Deep, slow breaths, almost like it was smelling the tent, smelling me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the panic rising in my throat. It's just an animal. It'll go away. But the breathing didn't stop. It stayed there, for what felt like hours, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. And then it spoke. Not words, not exactly, but a low, garbled sound, like something trying to mimic speech. The noise twisted and warbled, like a voice broken into pieces, repeating something I couldn't understand. It sent chills down my spine. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it a person? But no human made sounds like that. Was it some kind of animal? But animals don't try to talk. They don't breathe like that. And then, without warning, the tent collapsed inward as if someone, was pressing down on it, hard. I could see the fabric bowing under the weight, and I swear I saw a hand, pale and long, pressing against the top of the tent, slowly dragging its fingers across the surface. I snapped. I grabbed my flashlight, fumbled with the zipper, and burst out of the tent, shining the beam into the night. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the fire long dead, the trees standing silently like they had been all night. But the air was wrong. The oppressive heaviness was still there, and I could feel it watching me, even if I couldn't see it. I stood there for what felt like hours, flashlight shaking in my hand, heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I backed away from the tent, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't listen. I kept turning, shining the light into the trees, expecting to see something, anything, lurking just beyond the reach of the beam. And then I saw it. A figure, pale, thin, unnaturally tall, standing between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But it watched me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I bolted. I didn't pack up. I didn't even try. I just grabbed my keys and ran. The hike back to the car was a blur, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the dark. The whole time, I could hear it behind me, that same rustling, that same breathing following me, always just out of sight but never far enough away. I don't know how long I ran, but I eventually reached my car, threw myself inside, and sped out of there without looking back. I haven't gone camping since. I barely sleep at night anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that breathing, feel that presence just outside my room, watching, waiting. And every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, too terrified to sleep, I hear that garbled, broken voice trying to speak again. But I'll never understand what it's trying to say.